Hello and welcome to the Idaho Reports podcast. I'm Logan Finney. Immigration was one of the top issues of the 2024 election at the top of President Trump's priority list. And here in Idaho in 2025, Governor Brad Little has indicated that he is willing to go along with those federal priorities.
I do not lose sleep over it, but I am interested in and concerned about it. And I'm really concerned about, dreamers and people who have been here for long, the stress that it puts in their life. I think that is, but we're all in, whether it's my corrections, whether it's my law enforcement, fill in the blank, that we will cooperate. And I actually think the more we cooperate, the less focus there'll be on Idaho.
Joining me to discuss immigration issues here in Idaho is Rachel Spacek with InvestigateWest. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Governor Little has indicated that he is directing the state government, the state executive agencies to comply with federal mandates regarding immigration. He even signed an executive order recently to that effect. Tell us a little bit more in detail about what that looks like from the state level working with the feds in this area.
Mm-hmm. So Little's executive order really reinforces what already existed. The state agencies that he ordered to comply with federal immigration authorities were Idaho State Police, the Department of Corrections, and the Commission on Pardons and Paroles, I believe. And they all already honor ICE detainers, which is when ICE wants to place a hold on an undocumented person that's held in prison in this case, and all of those agencies will honor those and will hold that person in custody until ICE wants to take custody over them. And so that policy has already existed. And in fact, sheriff's departments and local jails also hold ICE prisoners if asked to by ICE. So what Little's executive order really does is just kind of indicates that he is supportive of the Trump administration's efforts to deport people, especially criminals. And so it doesn't really change anything policy-wise in what the state agencies are already doing, but just kind of indicates support for those immigration enforcement efforts.
And if we break things down a little bit here, it's a situation where the federal government, we've got our federal government, state government, federalism, they're separate. Federal government enforces immigration and they're in charge of that whole system. So it's really important for the state government to be working with them because it's often the local state officials like a sheriff or a police department that's interacting with these people, right? Can you walk through, for people who aren't familiar with how that handoff process works between the state and the feds, can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the state or local law enforcement agencies are the ones kind of on the ground working on law enforcement, and if they arrest someone who ends up being in the country illegally, ICE can order that local agency to hold that person by federal law, and then they will kind of come in and decide if they're going to go through the deportation process with that person. But in Idaho, that collaboration really does exist, and we saw it in the first Trump administration and even sometimes in the Biden administration. Just local entities and state entities working with the federal government on those efforts.
The state legislature here in Idaho is also really focused on this. Talk to us about the legislation that we've seen so far.
Yes, so we've seen a House bill that also went through a Senate committee on Friday, and that legislation was brought by Jaron Crane in the House, and it would create a state crime. So we were kind of talking about the separation of immigration has been a federal crime, crossing the border illegally, and what the legislature is trying to do with this bill is kind of make it a state crime to have crossed the border illegally and, be in Idaho. And so it would create a state crime, and it would allow law enforcement agencies, if they've arrested a person on a separate crime, to record that person's immigration status. So determine if they're in the country illegally. And if they are, it would make it a misdemeanor on the first offense. And then if they're arrested again on a separate arrest and they haven't obtained legal status, it would be a felony. And in the first iteration of Crane's bill, it would be on an Idaho judge to kind of issue a deportation order for that person. So that's kind of really entering into territory of like the state kind of trying to kind of get into the federal territory of enforcing immigration law.
There's been questions about that because that's kind of what Texas did recently, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the actual first iteration of Crane's bill was basically a replica of that Texas law that is being challenged by federal judges right now. But the first iteration was making it a state crime to be in the country illegally and not having that added component of you having to have been arrested for a separate crime. So it would basically allow law enforcement to arrest people for being undocumented, which brought up a lot of challenges and concerns for the racial profiling aspect of that.
Sure, we heard plenty of testimony in committee as well as from some lawmakers that they didn't want this to turn into a papers, please type of law, I think is how one of them put it.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly, Arizona also saw a papers, please type of legislation, in Texas as well. So yeah, we're kind of seeing a little bit of that in Idaho.
So now that we've hit that House versus Senate negotiation phase of this, they're making sure that there's a secondary crime involved in this. Talk to us about the status of the legislation right now that it's kind of shifted a little bit.
Yes. So in the Senate State Affairs Committee on Friday, Senator Todd Lakey kind of signaled that he wanted to combine the House bill that I just talked about with a Senate bill that would kind of do similar things, but specifically related to violent crime. So it would add a crime that you can't be undocumented and commit a violent crime. And if you did, it would add jail time to your sentence. It would also make it illegal to transport someone that fits that description and make them ineligible for probation. So it kind of adds a lot more to that. And so it's kind of been signaled that it would be a combination of those two bills. But Senator Lakey also mentioned that he would want to continue to allow the federal government to order deportation, so not make it so that Idaho judges have to, deport someone or order deportation for someone. But there would still be, he said, the aspect of adding jail time or prison time to a person who is undocumented and convicted of a federal crime.
Okay, very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we'll keep an eye on the amending order in the Senate and see how that shakes out. It's no secret that Idaho's agriculture sector really relies heavily on undocumented labor. What are you hearing from ag sector folks as they're looking at what's happening at the State House and what's happening at the federal level?
Yeah, so actually the Idaho Dairymen's Association, we heard that they were pretty involved in that first iteration of the House bill that I mentioned that we said brought concerns of racial profiling. The Dairymen's Association was involved in working with Crane to kind of try to eliminate that, and I imagine because they were worried that, their workers might be targeted by that type of
Even
law.
the ones with legal status.
Even the ones with legal status, yes. So they worked on that with Crane and kind of came to the bill that we're talking about now. And then there's also legislation that was introduced a few weeks ago that would require all Idaho employers to run their employees through a e-verification system that would flag if they were ineligible to work legally in the U.S. And there's a lot of concerns from the agriculture industry because they do rely on undocumented labor, and that bill would require that they fire any employees that were not in the country illegally, and that could be detrimental to not just their business but also our food system. And so there are lots of lobbying efforts against that type of legislation. And just in general, I think that in talking to the Dairymen's Association specifically, I think they are hoping that their workers might not be the people targeted for deportations. You know, we did kind of hear from the Trump administration early on, not so much now, that they would be targeting people convicted of crimes for deportations. But, you know, national reporting shows that lots of people who are not criminals have kind of been wrapped up in these deportation efforts. So, yeah, I think the dairymen are also really hoping for congressional, for federal protections for these workers, a path to legal status for people who've been working in agriculture for a certain amount of time, just because I think when they talk about it, undocumented workers have been working for a long time in many cases in Idaho, are kind of staples in the community and in their businesses, so I think they're really worried about protecting these people from deportation.
All right, well, we will keep an eye on all these issues, and we'll keep an eye out for your future immigration reporting. Rachel Spacek with InvestigateWest, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Idaho Reports podcast. Tune in to the Friday show at 8 p.m. on Idaho Public Television, and visit idahoreports.org to stream episodes and keep up to date with the events of the 2025 legislative session.
Programming support is provided by the Idaho Humanities Council, deepening understanding of the shared human experience by connecting people with ideas and local public programs exploring history, law, literature, and citizenship through the humanities.
Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.